I'm not a professional writer, novelist, or author in any way, shape, or form. This novelization may contain grammatical errors and dialogue inconsistencies that conflict with the original source material. I'm also not a professional voice actor or reading specialist. I did the best I could and kept the best takes, so this is really just for the enjoyment of fans of the original source material and curious people. This work is technically classified as fan fiction and greatly expands upon the original source material. Please enjoy and support the official release.
Chapter 2 Scourge in the Darkness. A bit of candlelight was all that lit up the pages of what seemed to be an old book whose pages were consumed by text and symbols. The room was dark, with shadows all around, and only a little bit of candlelight was the only source of light amidst the darkness of night. All that could be seen was a table in the center of the dark room, littered with open books and closed books stacked several volumes high. Some parchment paper and an inkwell lay slightly beside what appeared to be an open book, with a limp, yellow-gloved hand sitting upon it, and on the other side of the book resting upon the table, a lone yellow sack steeple hat with a wide, full-circled rim. Sitting in a chair next to the table was a nearly hidden silhouette of a man cloaked in robes of midnight blue. His body was limp, and the shadow of his head was tilted downward towards his legs. He was motionless, except for his chest moving slowly with each breath he took. The calm and quiet night were the only sounds within the room itself. It seemed peaceful in those silent moments, but the night itself was too quiet. Suddenly, a loud banging sound came from across the room. "Taiyu! Taiyu! Dr. Yoon is calling for you! Taiyu!" shouts a young man as he raps upon the door a few more times. The shadowy figure stumbles up, his hand recoiling back to himself from his book, as if startled. "I'll be right there!" The youthful yet refined-voiced shadowy figure of Taiyu responds as he quickly reached for his steeple hat on the table and quickly stands up, making his way through the darkness slowly. He could barely see, his eyes not fully adjusted to the darkness as he was trying to get to the door. A loud crack and a thud rang out as Taiyu groaned loudly, his head smashing into the wall of the room and his body crashing down onto the floor, dropping his hat beside him in the darkness. "Taiyu, are you okay? This is really important," the young man shouts again. "I'm fine. I'll meet him in his office. Hurry back." Taiyu shouts back, his voice seeming wearily delicate, as he gets up to his feet slowly and grabs his hat from the floor. He feels the wall in front of him as he uses it to guide him to a small barrel where several long walking staffs could be found in it. After feeling around, he grabs one, pulls it from the barrel, and uses it to feel his way around. Finally, he finds the doorknob as he lets out a sigh of relief. He places the steeple hat on his head firmly as he opens the door, leading out. The hallway of the dormitory was lit moderately with small candles hanging from brass arms on the wooden walls. As the light of the candles illuminated the hallway, Taiyu stood there trying to get his bearings straight. He wore a midnight blue robe made of thick burlap that went all the way from his shoulders and nearly reached down to the floor. The robe was held closed with a few leather straps across his chest, with silver buckles binding them, and a long piece of rope tied around his waist. Near where his neck would be, the collar of his robe was lifted up, and completely surrounded his face as if it were covered by a loosely worn scarf. Two smaller leather straps with silver buckles actually pulled the collar together, hiding the lower half of Taiyu's face, while the steeple hat, which was slightly bent downward at the highest part of the tip of the steeple, covered the top of his head, hiding almost all of his face from shadow. The reflection of the candlelight was the only thing that could be seen where his face would be, the candlelight reflecting off of his eyes. He had a black satchel that was strapped across his shoulder and hanged down at his side, as his right hand, equipped with a matching yellow leather glove, held a firm wooden staff that he had grabbed from the barrel earlier, the staff being as tall as he was, with a small zigzagging pattern near the top. Taiyu made his way down the long wooden hall of the dormitory with his staff and feet tapping lightly along the floorboards. As he moved, the robe would open now and then below his waist, revealing a golden, yellow, green, and white striped pair of trousers that were made of soft cloth. His feet were covered with 2 small cloth shoes with hard leather soles that were held closed by 2 strings of rope. He made his way to the end of the hall and quickly opened the door leading out into the night. Stars filled the sky as he looked down from atop the hill to the village below. The night was quiet and the air was dank and moist. A small layer of mist covered the earth beneath him as he could barely see the soil below. The few houses down around the town outskirts were blacked out and almost blended in with the darkness of the night. All of the trees in sight were dead, not a single leaf visible. And for the few patches of earth he could see, there was no grass, and only the leafless bushes in sight. Teo could see lanterns hanging from long metal rods jammed into the ground. That was the best sign he could make out to keep him on the pebbled road as he made his way down towards the town center from the hilltop dormitory. The town itself was almost void of people. The sounds of hacking, coughing, and a woman crying were faint but still audible. The mist still covered most of the ground and only kicked up a little as Teo moved through the streets of the town center, his staff tapping along the cobblestone as he moved. Many of the homes were made of stone rocks with hay roofs, though some homes were nicer than others with wooden roofs, yet not a single light came from any of the windows. Luckily, the lanterns made it easy for Teo to make his way through the town as he found himself moving towards a large stone building at the far end of the main street leading through town. A group of men were seen standing in the street near the front door of the large stone building as Teo slowly made his way up to them, his pace slowing down as he approached. The men were armed with swords and makeshift shields made from what appears to be barrel and box lids. A large man stood in front of the group of men with a large axe resting on his shoulder, but he quickly spotted Teo and held his weapon with both hands at the ready.
"Identify yourself!"
The large man shouted, his voice deep and full. "It's me, Teo," he replies as his stern yet refined voice calls out. The large man then puts his axe back on his shoulder as he steps to the side.
"Out of the way, lads. Let him through,"
the large man says as the other men make an opening between them. Teo approaches the group of men at his usual pace, only to stop in front of the axe-wielding men. Have they gotten worse?
"Aye, the blotches are getting bigger, and some of them are starting to cough up mucus,"
the large man says, whispering back. "If you go into the school, I would suggest you cover your nose and mouth with cloth," Teo says as he moves past the large man, continuing to the 2 large double doors leading into the building.
"Oi, lads, rip some of the cloth off of your shirts and wear 'em over your faces. Gotta protect yourselves like the pencil pusher says,"
the large man says as he rests the axe down against the side of his left leg as he pulls out at his shirt and starts to rip off some of the material. Teo pushes the doors open as he enters into a large, well-lit hall with people lying on animal skin blankets and on the benches lining the walls to where you can see almost nothing but bodies everywhere. People hacking, coughing, shivering, crying, all over the place with only a thin passageway through the horde of sick people. Among the sickly were their families sitting beside their loved ones, seeming to tend to their every need. As Teo moved past the people laying about the floor, he noticed a young woman cleaning a small boy with a sponge and a bucket of water. Teo made his way beside the woman to see that the boy's shirt was open, revealing several blisters and seeping boils. On his body were dark purple blotches that were hard to make out. At first they looked like bruises, but they had a putrid yellow rim around each blot. One of the blots almost seemed as big as Teo's own fist, as he rests his staff on the ground and kneels down before the child. "These bruises just showed up this evening," the young woman says, looking upon Teo with eyes sore red from all the tears that have run down her face. Teo looks at her silently and then back at the boy. He leans forward, examining the blotches closer, and then he moves to examine the boy's face. He touches the skin above and below the boy's left eye with his index finger and thumb, as he pushes the skin apart and looks into the boy's left eye closely. He notices that the iris of the eye was a natural green, but burgundy spots were littered about the iris, some of the spots bigger than others. He also noticed that the white of the eye had a slight bluish-greenish tint to it. He quickly examined the other eye to see the same effect displayed, as he let go of the skin of the boy, letting his eyes relax, as he looks back towards the purple blotches on his skin. He presses on the largest blotch as he watches the boy to see if the child reacts to him. As he presses harder into the boy, the child squirmed uncomfortably as he groaned mildly in pain. Teu, pulling his hand off the boy, reaches into his satchel and pulls out a knife and a roll of bandages. He takes the knife and presses the tip of the blade against the largest purple blotch on the boy, then looks over at the boy as he slowly and carefully presses the tip of the blade into the blotch, penetrating his skin. The boy let out a soft yelp as Teu brought his knife out from the child and wiped the blade clean with a piece of bandage. He cut off the piece of bandage from the roll of bandages that he had wiped his knife on and put the knife away. He then took the cut piece of bandage and laid it over the small puncture wound he made on the purple blotch found on the boy. He then pressed on both sides of the bandage as the bandage itself slowly turned a deep purple. After a few moments had passed, he pulled the bandage up from the boy and observed it carefully. It was like a thick purple molasses. It seemed to not even drip from the bandage itself, and it was slightly glossy in the candlelight. The smell of the bandage, however, was more intense and interesting than the make and density of the purple fluid. It stank of rotting flesh, and with a gross and disturbing sweet hint of infected feces. He made a soft gasp at the smell of the goop as he wadded the bandage up with more bandages. He slowly rose to his feet as he grabbed his staff, and his eyes slowly made his way over to the young woman. "Use the rest of the bandages to wrap your brother up," Teu said as he looked across the rest of the large hall, seeing all the sickly people around him. He took a moment as he seemed lost in thought. His eyes closed for a moment. Opening his eyes and looking down towards the far end of the hall, he made his way to a man he saw lying on the floor in a fetal position. He observed the blotches on the man's body as he knelt down to the floor, again resting his staff beside him, as he opened the man's shirt to reveal the same kind of purple blotches. Unlike the boy, though, the man had bandages wrapped around his neck. The man was too busy shivering in pain to notice or respond to Tao's presence, as Tao reached down to the neck bandaging and began to unwrap them. As he was halfway done, he could see the skin looking dark red beneath the bandages, as he began to unwrap faster. As he removed the last bits of bandage, he could see 2 large puncture wounds on the man's neck, and though they seemed to have clotted and not bleed, it seemed that the wounds have festered. He quickly wrapped the man's neck back up and rose from the floor, pondering his observations again in silence. He reached down to pick up his staff, and he made his way through a small door at the back right side of the hall that led to a stairwell leading to the second floor of the school building. He made his way to the second floor, and upon opening the door, it revealed a small hallway with 8 doors lining each side of the hall, with candles lighting up the hallway. A handful of people were seen sitting on benches or laying upon the ground as Teu moved quickly past them to the second-to-last door on the right, as he tapped his staff against it firmly 3 times. He waited for a few moments, quietly, and then tapped again.
"Yes, yes, come in,"
a gruff old voice shouted from the other side of the door as Teu swiftly let himself in. The room was well lit, as a fireplace kept the room comfy and warm. The walls were lined with several bookshelves filled with leather-bound books on almost every shelf. The floor was covered with a dark red carpet, and across from the door was a large mahogany desk covered with papers and used inkwells. A man sat at the desk in the wooden chair facing towards the fireplace to his right, as he turns his head slightly to face Teu as he entered. "The patients are getting worse," Teu says as he moves to the center of the room, his hat and robe still hiding his face from sight.
"I know. 4 more show signs of the sickness,"
the man says as he no longer looks at Teu directly and stares at the fireplace. They are becoming septic, rotting from within. This is a plague, unlike anything I have ever seen before, Tehu replies as he stands unwavering and completely still.
We are running out of options and time,
the man says, his voice shaking a bit as his eyes stay fixed on the fireplace. The bite marks on McDougal are also showing signs of severe infection. Is there any creature that can cause this? Tehu asks as he keeps a close eye on the man in the chair.
Perhaps, but more importantly, the majority of the sick have never been bitten by anything. Just McDougal, Sheriff, and Meryl's daughter. Funny thing is that Sheriff is not even sick at all. It doesn't add up,
the man says as he slowly turns his face towards Tehu again. Then perhaps the bite marks are not correlated to whatever is plaguing these people, Tehu replies as he moves closer to the desk, his eyes narrowing as he moves across the room.
That is likely. Sheriff was bit first, but nothing ever came of it. McDougal and Meryl's kid are downstairs, and you said they are as sick as all the others. In all my years of study, I have never seen anything like this before,
the man says as he lowers his head on his desk in defeat, his hands combing through his hair till they rest on the back of his white hair. The skin atop his head is almost visible through the thin strands of white hair as he slowly leans back up in the chair and pulls his hands from his head, resting them on his desk. In the light, his face was aged slightly, seeming to be a man in his 60s, with wrinkles around around the dimples of his face and the cheeks on his side. A narrow and almost pointy chin jutting out from his clean-shaven face. The man wore nothing more than a night robe of dark green tied at the waist with a yellow sash, and only had simple shoes made from cloth on his feet. Both men were silent for several minutes, both of them seeming lost in thought. A muffled call could be heard from outside as Tehu broke out of his thoughtful trance, though he could not make out who was calling out. It sounded as if it were a warning of something going on outside. His eyes catch the man sitting at the desk, ready to get up from his chair, as Tehu puts his hand out towards him, gesturing him to remain seated behind the desk. The call came out again, as in that very moment Tehu began to make his way towards the office door.
I will return momentarily, Dr. Yoon,
Tehu says, opening and closing the door behind him in a swift motion.
Identify yourself, lady, now!
The large man shouted, even more loudly than before as he held his axe at the ready. Tehu made his way out of the doors of the school, closing them firmly behind him as he looked out into the mist-covered streets to see what appeared to be a woman wearing a torn white nightgown. One of the other men guarding the door backs up towards Tehu, keeping his eyes forward as he holds his sword clumsily in his hand. Tehu doesn't seem to pay the man much attention as he moves beside the sword-wielding man.
She's not responding, Master Tehu,
the man says softly, keeping his eyes forward. She looks familiar, does she not? Tehu replies as he stands motionlessly, keeping his eyes on the woman in the street.
It's me wife, Sheriff, lad,
the sword-wielding man says louder as he begins to move up towards the large man with the axe.
Stay back, boyo,
the large man says, using his arm to keep the other man at bay.
Get off me, Garrick. I know me own wife when I sees her,
the man says, pushing the large man's hand away as he shuffles down the street a ways towards the woman. Slowly, Tehu makes his way forward as he could only hear soft murmuring coming from down the street. He stood beside Garrick silently as he observed what was happening before him. The sound of him sniffing the air could be heard from under his robes and hat as his eyes continued to look forward with a stern look, his eyes narrowing.
There is something afoot,
Tehu says, not looking away from the woman in the street that the other guard was beginning to come in range of.
Mills, get back here, you fool!
Garrick yells as his booming voice echoes through the streets. It was faint, but the sounds of flesh dragging along the cobblestone road could barely be heard as Tehu kept his gaze locked on the woman. It was subtle at first, but under the light of the lanterns he started to make out the shapes of 3 other human-like beings shuffling behind the woman a few yards further down the street. Tehu still didn't react, but he kept his eyes peeled at what he observed happening before him.
Lads, make ready. We have visitors.
Garrick shouts as he readies his axe. The other 3 guards quickly get beside Teo and Garrick and draw their swords and ready their makeshift shields.
Hold here. I will deal with this myself,
Teo says as he moves away from Garrick and his men without hesitation.
Master Teo, you can't...
Garrick's voice faded out as Teo ignored him completely. Mills had reached Sheris out in the distance as the soft sound of Teo's staff tapping along the cobblestone road could be heard slightly over the shuffling of feet coming from behind Sheris herself. Her face was completely covered by her long, nappy red hair as she seemed to mildly stumble with each step. As Mills moved to her side, he calls to her name time and time again, trying to get a response from her. Yet no response came as she continued to move her frail-looking body down the street, leaving Mills behind her. As Mills stared blankly at her back, it was in a swift motion that he was grabbed by a strong hand, gripping him hard as he could feel nails digging into his shoulder through his tunic. Mills let out a loud scream as he could feel teeth biting into him, his flesh tearing away. The 3 human-like figures came into view under the lanterns as they pulled Mills down to the ground. Their bodies were almost rotted away, with chunks of rotting flesh still making them seem human. Their bodies covered with muddied, tattered rags that began to turn red at the sight of the blood splatting out from Mills' body as they began to consume him. Their fingers began to puncture his stomach as they began to pull out Mills' entrails. Teo, however, did not take his eyes off of Sheris, who was now getting much closer to him as he stopped his progression towards her. There were no words spoken as Teo's sharp gaze was fixed on Sheris, only being about 15 yards away from him. Where she had ignored Mills' calls, she did stop her advancement before Teo, her body seeming pale in the light of the street lanterns. Both stood there silently as only the sounds of gnawing and bone snapping could be heard behind her. Teo then tapped his staff once against the ground in front of himself, while the other hand lay rested at his side, his palm open, facing away from Sheris. As the tap rang out, Sheris flipped her head upward, her face being revealed by the light of the lanterns. Black ooze and gore dripped from her chin as 2 long fangs protruded from the top of her gaping mouth. The rest of her jaw was lined with sharp dagger-like teeth, and her lips were purple in color, with chunks of her flesh missing from the various parts of her mouth, revealing dark, inky gums. Her eyes were completely pitch black as she let out a loud hiss, her arms slowly rising up and her fingers spread wide. She didn't move from her spot as she wailed maniacally and clawed out in front of her in the air. It was not more than a few moments later that the flesh-rotted ghouls were coming up slowly from behind her, they themselves letting out soft groans and moans. Teo did not flinch, nor did he even blink for a moment. He let out another tap from his staff as it echoed out into the street again. The ghouls wailed louder and Sheris hissed loudly again, this time with black ooze projecting itself from her mouth, her chin becoming more covered by the black sludge. Neither the ghouls or Sheris, however, pressed towards Teo, as he looked back at them with cold, narrowing eyes. Lifting his staff yet again, he let it tap against the cobblestone road covered in mist, as the wooden staff rings out again. Sheris lunged forward, snarling at him with her blood-stained hands coming more into view. Teo did not hesitate, or shudder, as the undead abomination came stampeding towards him with claws reaching forward. It was a swift movement as his left hand came up in front of his face, his palm facing sideways and his fingers were pointing to the sky. His pinky finger and ring finger touched the palm of his own hand, while his middle and index finger remained erect, pointing upward, while his thumb pointed back at his own face. Without blinking, a little red light formed atop his middle finger, as he moves his hand out of the way, catching the little red light in his hand and closing his fist around it. He pushes his hand out in front of him and opens his palm. A massive blaze of red and blue fire swirls out from his palm, reaching in front of him, causing Sheris and the ghouls to fall out of view, as only bright fire could be seen continuously pouring out from Teo's palm. The fire reached far as its path began to widen across the cobblestone road as the roar of the flames raged loudly. An ear-piercing scream wailed out and echoed loudly as it bounced off every building. The screaming started high in pitch as it became low and guttural, and then suddenly shrieked high again as the fire continued to burn forward. The flames have raged on for what felt like a minute when Teu finally closed the palm of his hand, the fire suddenly vanishing from sight. The body of Sheris was wreathed in fire from head to toe, the screaming face still fixed on Teu as there was no hair, eyes, or nails, just burnt flesh screaming at him in pain. She no longer was lumbering towards him as her body slowly began to fall apart at her legs, the burnt flesh falling off her body as she collapsed onto the cobblestone road below her. Her burnt body crawled bit by bit towards Teu as she continued to crumble into burnt pieces, the sounds of her screams slowly starting to scratch away into gasps. Finally, the last remnants of her body lay motionless along the streets, turning into nothing more than smoke and ash. Behind Sheris's ashes, the ghouls had already found themselves burnt away, leaving only a few bits and pieces of them left. Teu stood silently in the street, not moving a muscle, his eyes peering out into the darkness of the night as he continued to keep his eyes fixed on the road before him. He sensed someone or something, a presence watching him out in the darkness. He kept his wits about him as he remained focused and still. He could hear what sounded like a deep, otherworldly growl resonating out beyond his sight as he stood silently. Garrick and another one of the guards quickly came up from behind Teu as he stood quietly and not seeming to react to Garrick and his men. Again, Teu observed the darkness in silence and in thought, as he came to and pulled his left hand to his face, noticing smoke rising from his unscathed glove, and then his eyes turning their attention towards Garrick. "Be alert," Teu said as he turned away from the street and made his way quickly back towards the school doors. The two men did not respond as they stared out on what was left of the monsters and Mill's corpses with disbelief. Teu made his way up to one of the guards standing at the door as the man trembled before Teu slightly after witnessing the confrontation. "Bring me McDougal and Meryl's daughter, the little girl in the west hallway. Bring them outside. Now!" Teu said sternly and without blinking an eye as his cold stare pierced the guards. The man stumbled about himself but quickly made his way into the school without a second thought as he slammed the doors behind him. Teu looked out into the street again as he noticed the two men coming back to their post, his eyes not wandering as he remained focused on the task at hand and what he must do. The chamber door leading to Dr. Yun's office opened swiftly and in a similar motion closed as Teu entered the chamber. Though the expression of Teu was hidden under his robes and steeple hat, Dr. Yun stared into the man's eyes for what felt like several minutes. Neither man spoke up as they both stood quietly staring at each other. The only subtle movement was Dr. Yun slowly biting his lower lip as his eyes began to water. Teu slowly moved up to the desk, looking down at Dr. Yun with a seemingly blank but slightly upsetting stare.
"By the sounds of the screaming, I assume you took care of it?"
Dr. Yun asks, his voice seeming to break mildly as he spoke. Teu did not answer him, as he just continued to stare at him. The only audible noise was a deep breath he took in and the crackling of the fireplace.
"This is only going to get worse. There is no option left but for us to seek help,"
Dr. Yun says as he rises from his desk, his arms pressed against the desktop, propping him up.
"And what do you suppose we do, Doctor? Read more books on plagues, curses, and ancient Lufinian tinctures? Perhaps I will discover some secret elven cure in the volumes of untranslated books here,"
Teu says sarcastically, but with not an ounce of humor in his voice. Dr. Yun quickly slammed a closed fist on the table, as the sound was only dampened by the papers beneath his fist. He looked up at Teu, his face filled with anger and absolute frustration as he made his way to the fireplace in silence. He placed his left hand against the stone of the chimney as his right hand reached out towards the flame. Little specks of what seemed like ice drizzled down from his hand as a hint of cold air filled the room. The fireplace flickered violently against the shards of ice as the fire went out. Dr. Yoon then bent forward slightly, lowering his tall, narrow body down, and used his cold, frosted hand to reach into the chimney through the fireplace. As Dr. Yoon pulled his hand back from the fireplace, Taeyu could see him holding what looked like a steel box. Slowly, the doctor looked down at the box in his hands, and then his eyes met with Taeyu's again. He slid open the door of the box, and inside he pulled out a small object wrapped in what seemed to be soft cloth. He then laid the box on his desk as he slowly began to unwrap the object in his hand. Taeyu stood silently as he watched the doctor turn back to face him. In his right hand was an object that looked like a small black volcanic rock or jet black stone. Taeyu looked at it for but a moment, only to feel himself focus more and more on the stone as he stared at it.
This is the only bargaining chip we have. I've held on to this since it was given to me by the Master Mage of this school when he asked me to take it over before he died. This was gifted to him by the Master Mage before him and the Master Mage before that. I give this to you now as a final currency to get us help.
Dr. Yun says, his voice cracking as he spoke and began to sound defeated.
How will this get us any help whatsoever?
Taeyu asks as he looks back at the doctor questioningly, his eyes observing the worn-out demeanor of the doctor, his tone being much less harsh.
The King of Cornelia came to me some years ago asking about this. I refused to give it to him, as it was the property of not just the school, but the people of Melmond. He was worried that something horrible would happen to our village, and now here we are.
Dr. Yun says as he leans against his desk, holding the blackened crystal out in front of him. How will giving the king this crystal solve our problems? Taeyu asks as he gazes back towards the crystal in the doctor's hand.
It will not be given to him, Taeyu, not to anyone. I am giving this crystal to you,
Dr. Yun says as he pushes himself off from the table and moves up to Taeyu as he offers him the crystal.
What is it that you want me to do, Doctor?
Taeyu asks as he takes the crystal from the doctor's hand and stares at it curiously as it rests in his own palm.
Go to Cornelia and ask the king for aid. Ask him if he knows what is going on here and if it has anything to do with the crystal.
Dr. Yun requests as he moves back to his desk and sits down slowly, his eyes staring blankly at the doused fireplace.
Do tell, why do you think that this crystal has anything to do with what is going on around here?
Taeyu asks in an inquisitive tone as he moves up towards the desk and leans towards the doctor.
Merrill came in here this afternoon to update me on his daughter's condition. He mentioned that she was talking in her sleep. Merrill said that she was rambling about a rock or stone, that she had to find it.
Dr. Yun says as he leans back in his chair.
Whatever is out there, I believe, is seeking out this crystal. It is no longer safe here, Taeyu,
he adds as he looks down towards his lap, his body seeming tired. Taeyu stood staring at the crystal as he became lost in thought. Taeyu knew of magic stones and trinkets existing in the world, but nothing like this. The crystal, seeming to lack any magical qualities to it, just seemed like an ashen-stained shard of glass. Yet Dr. Yun was hiding the crystal here in his office the whole time, as his masters did before him. It was a strange request to be entrusted with such an object wrapped in an enigmatic cloak of mystery waiting to be explored.
I will do as you ask, Doctor. I shall leave at first light,
Taeyu says as he starts to make his way towards the office door, the curiosity of Taeyu finally taking over, making his decision all the easier to make.
Wait, Taeyu. I would suggest you stay here tonight, then go to the dormitory. Tomorrow morning I will lend you my horse, who can take you as far as the Dogar Mountains. From there you will have to trek on foot through the snow and high cliffs till you reach Cornelia. Pack hearty, for it will take you several weeks to pass over the mountain range.
Dr. Yun says as he opens one of his desk drawers and pulls out a pouch full of coins. Teu turns back to face the doctor as he nods silently back to him. He moves back towards the table and grabs the pouch of coin and places it in his satchel. He then turns away from the doctor and swiftly leaves the room, closing the door behind him.
I'd wish him luck, but it may be too late for us.
The doctor says as he leans back in his chair again, his eyes blankly staring at the burnt-out fireplace in silence, as the sounds of coughing, groaning, and crying murmured audibly, as there was no more crackling of the fireplace to help drown out the sounds of the suffering townsfolk within the walls of the school. And this was a chapter of a novelization of Final Fantasy. This is my first time ever creating a fan fiction, and on top of that, this is the first time I've ever narrated one out loud. I'm still learning how to do this, and hopefully it appealed to some of you. Give it a thumbs up, comment, subscribe, give me any criticism, good and bad, and I will try to get the next episode out as soon as possible. Thank you guys for stopping by. We'll see you next time.